Então, passamos agora ao nosso segundo palestrante, o professor Gregory Cooper, que é professor associado de filosofia e diretor do programa de Sociedade das Profissões em Ética da Washington University, nos Estados Unidos. O professor Gregory Cooper tem seu bacharelado na Universidade de Wisconsin, seu doutorado na Universidade de Minnesota, e faz pesquisa na área de ética e as profissões, ética normativa, filosofia e políticas públicas e filosofia da ciência, e é autor de um livro muito conhecido na área de filosofia da ecologia, que é o The Science of the Struggle for Existence, on the Foundations of Ecology. E hoje o professor Gregory Cooper nos falará sobre rumo a uma filosofia da modelagem e ecologia, com especial ênfase sobre o desenvolvimento e aplicação de modelos baseados em indivíduos. I'd like to thank Greg very much for coming here and speak to us, and we are really pleased.
I think this is, now it's on. Bom dia. That's the extent of my Portuguese. So I want to thank Charbel, Pedro, and Renata, and Neil, and Francisco, and all the students and everyone here for making this such a pleasant experience. This is like my 6th time to Brazil, but my first time to Salvador, and it's great. I like coming to Brazil. It's wonderful, and I'm so impressed with the energy and the quality and the projects in general. This is you guys should be very proud of what you have going here. So it's been a real treat. So I'm going to talk. I mean, this is like the sort of the opposite end of some pole or other from the talk that you just heard. I'm going to talk about the philosophy of modeling. I should say in advance that philosophy of science, and this is going to be a talk on the philosophy of science. Philosophy of science has, for so much of its history, taken physics as the paradigm science, right? And it's built its conceptual machinery to handle what happens in physics. And so it's not very well prepared to help us understand what goes on in a science like ecology. And in particular, we really don't have a philosophy of modeling.
Right.
I mean, that is...
Just ask me to
Oh.
speak a little.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So we don't have a philosophy of modeling in the philosophy of science. We're in the process, I guess, of building one, and I suppose this is, working toward that end. So I want to do two things. The talk is really in two parts. The first part is in the first part I will talk about give a general framework for classifying various kinds of general knowledge claims or generalizations in ecology. And then in the second part, I'll talk about the ways in which we use models to try to come to understand and expand on those general knowledge claims. And I have to also confess that I suck at developing PowerPoints, so and I'm sandwiched between two very slick presenters, so you just have to suffer through my slides. So this is an outline of the first part of the talk. I'm going to talk about kinds of generalizations. I'm going to talk about something called nomicity, which is another word for the physical necessity or invariance of generalizations. I'm going to talk about our cognitive predicament in ecology, and then talk about the cognitive utility of some different kinds of generalizations given that cognitive predicament. And then finally, the importance of calibrating expectations in the process of evaluating our cognitive efforts, the importance of calibrating expectations to what the models are trying to achieve. And I'll come back to that theme in the second part as well. I told you. I warned you. So, but I can, unfortunately, the ideas I'm supposed to represent here are very simple, so the slide isn't doing any heavy lifting. This is a classic example that's used in the philosophy of science. I mean, it's more than classic, I guess. It's probably a sort of hackneyed example. But so the L and the B and the S. The L is supposed to represent an approaching low pressure system. The B is the behavior of a barometer, and the S is a storm, right? So, wow. And as you can see, time is sort of going in the direction of the bottom of the screen. So what happens is there's a causal relationship between the low pressure system and the behavior of the barometer, right? The low pressure system approaches, the barometer falls. That's what barometers are designed to do. There's also a causal relationship between the approach of the low pressure system and the subsequent rain or storm. But there is a correlation between the behavior of the barometer and the storm. It's not a causal relationship, but it's a correlation, and it's a reliable one, right? That's why barometers are, that's why they put them on ships and things, right? They're handy instruments because of the reliability of that correlation. So the first two generalizations, the generalizations between the low pressure system and the barometer and the low pressure system and the storm, are causal generalizations. The other generalization I will call a phenomenological generalization. So that's one dimension along which we can classify generalizations, right? They can exhibit more or less fidelity to the causal structure. They can be, the generalization between the low pressure system and the barometer exhibits more fidelity to the causal mechanisms than does the generalization between about the barometer and the approaching storm, which really doesn't tell us anything about the mechanisms. Right? So that's a dimension of variation, the generalizations. A second dimension of variation is concreteness or abstractness. Right? So in my book I use at the time I had this old Subaru, which whenever it was cold and rainy, it wouldn't start. And that was because it needed spark plug wires, which I didn't realize at the time, but it was well, you could formulate a generalization about my old Subaru that described its behavior in cold and rainy conditions, and maybe was quite specific about that particular car. That would be a very concrete generalization. Or you could generalize from my old Subaru to, 1984 Subarus generally. Maybe this wasn't an 84, but anyhow. Or you could. So what you're doing is you're abstracting away from the details of a particular case, right? Or, and if you want to be a good mechanic, you really need to abstract away from models in general, right? And learn to recognize that when spark plug wires are bad, cars don't start in cold, damp conditions. You guys probably don't know this in Salvador because cold, damp conditions are. But and then a third dimension is simply empirical scope, right? So Francisco and his students are studying the bay here, the Bahia de Todos os Santos. And in his talk, he asked questions about whether what they're learning about the bay can be generalized or not. And that's a question about empirical scope, right? It may be that, I think one of the things that you found, correct me if I'm wrong, was that that mangrove density did not respond to changes in salinity or patterns of salinity. Is that right? Is that one of the results? It did change. Oh, okay, sorry. So anyhow, the question then, whether that's true of other estuaries or other bays, is a question about empirical scope. So those are three dimensions that I'll come back to them in a second. But there's a fourth dimension, and I don't know how to represent that in three-dimensional space, so I'll just talk about it. But the fourth dimension has to do with this thing I was calling gnomic force. And nomic force is, in a sense, the necessity of a generalization. How sort of deeply is it woven into what we might call the laws of nature, or the generalization between the behavior of the barometer and the storm is a generalization that has a fair bit of nomic force, right? We can count on it in general, unless the barometer is broken. We can count on that relationship. Other generalizations, you know, don't have much. They're quite accidental, right? So, you know, all of the keys in my pocket are silver. That's true. But, you know, had I brought the key from my hotel room with me, which is gold, it wouldn't have been true, right? So it's a generalization that's true, but it wouldn't have taken much to overturn it. And that the idea behind nomic force is that it's a measure of the counterfactual circumstances under which a generalization continues to be true. So the generalization about the barometer in the storm continues to be true under lots and lots of counterfactual circumstances. Right? You've got a ship with a barometer, and it doesn't matter what color the ship is, it doesn't matter how big the ship is, it doesn't matter, you know, all sorts of things don't matter. To the, you know, that counterfactual continues to hold under all sorts of circumstances. The one about the silver key in my pocket, as I pointed out, could be undermined by the slightest of circumstances. Like, had I forgotten to drop my key off at the desk at the hotel, I'd have a gold key in my pocket, and then it wouldn't be true. So nomic force, one way to think about it then is how invariant is the counterfactual? How much does it take to undermine its truth? And generalizations or general knowledge claims with high nomic force have a high degree of invariance. There's one other thing that we can use here, and it's the notion of active versus passive counterfactuals. An active counterfactual is a counterfactual where the antecedent, what comes first in the counterfactual, is a condition that we can imagine being the results of a potential intervention, right? So, you know, let's see. The causal generalization, I guess,